Hello, everyone. Good morning to everyone in the Americas. Good afternoon to everyone in Europe and Asia, and Europe and Africa, and good evening to everyone in Asia and Australasia. My name is Steve Lacey, and I am the Director of Education for the Isrrt. And I'm very excited to bring today to you a wonderful presentation by Dr. Emma Hyde from the United Kingdom, who's going to be talking to us about patient-centered care within your own clinical setting. I'll just give a brief introduction to Dr. Emma, but before I do, I just want to let you know that if you have any questions, please put them on the into the Facebook live chat and as a comment, and we will try to get to those questions at the conclusion of the presentation. So just to introduce Dr. Emma Hyde, so she is a diagnostic radiographer who's currently working as an associate professor at the University of Derby in the United Kingdom. Her PhD work has sought to define informed measures of patient-centered care in diagnostic radiography. Emma is passionate about person-centered care and strives to embed it in day-to-day clinical practice, and her aim is to support both students and qualified practitioners to be as person-centered as possible. Individuals attending for medical imaging or radiotherapy are often anxious, in pain, confused, or disorientated, and Emma believes that we can all do more to make medical imaging and radiation therapy departments more welcoming environments that put our patients at the centre of everything. As well as her university role, Emma is also clinical director of the Person-Centered Care Institute, which trains health and care staff in England to deliver personalised care. Emma is the president of the United Kingdom Imaging and Oncology Congress, or the UKIO, for 2024 and 2025. She is a member of the International Community of Practice for Person-Centered Practice and has recently co-guest edited a special issue of Radiography dedicated to patient experience and patient voice. Welcome, Emma, to today's webinar, and looking forward to seeing your presentation.
Hello everyone, my name's Dr. Emma Hyde. I'm an Associate Professor in Diagnostic Imaging at the University of Derby in the UK. And in this talk today, I'm going to take you through person-centered approaches to care in diagnostic imaging. So I've got a few aims for today's session. First of all, I want us to firstly consider the challenges faced by diagnostic radiographers and medical imaging technologists during their day-to-day clinical practice at this time. Secondly, to improve understanding of what good person-centered care looks like within medical imaging. Thirdly, to discuss enablers and blockers to good person-centered care. And fourthly, to introduce a self-audit tool and action plan to help you become more person-centered in your clinical practice. First of all, though, we're going to start, as I said, with thinking about how person-centered care directly impacts on us, particularly in a time of a really challenging situation for those working in healthcare. And I always say that person-centered care must start with us as healthcare practitioners. We have to acknowledge at the moment the ongoing impact of COVID-19, and certainly here in the UK, that's been a significant challenge for us over the last 4 and a bit years. It's impacted on waiting lists. It's impacted on retention rates within the profession, it's impacted on staffing levels, and it's had a huge impact on stress and burnout. And so we need to actually think about that and acknowledge that before we can start to move on to think about how we can care for patients. I always say that person-centered care means you need to think about your own cup. How full is your cup? How able are you actually to deliver care to other people? And if we don't look after ourselves and make sure that we can do that, then we can't care for other people. So it's about thinking about what we need in terms of rest, relaxation, well-being strategies to actually ensure that we feel in a headspace, we can actually give person-centered care. Now that will be different for everybody, so I don't wish to tell you what you need to do to ensure your well-being so that you can deliver person-centered care. But I would like to encourage you to think about what helps you deal better with the day-to-day pressures of clinical practice and what helps you feel that you are in a better position to deliver high quality care. That's something for you to go away and think about, and remember Person-centred care must start with us. We must look after ourselves first and foremost so that we can look after other people. So after that encouragement to first of all look after yourself first so you can care for others, I'd like to just tell you now a little bit about my research into person-centred care in radiography and about where it all came from. So my research journey started when I was looking at the transition of first-year student radiographers from the academic environment here at the university into their first clinical placement. And what came out of that research was that students found it really, really hard to work with very ill patients. They found it quite overwhelming in terms of some of the sights, some of the smells, some of the things that they encountered. They also found quite a lot of dissonance between theory and practice in terms of the care that they observed. So what that means is they had been taught things in the university environment about how to care for people. For example, thinking about unconscious patients and the guidance to keep talking to an unconscious patient as if they were fully awake and alert. And what they saw was things like that not happening necessarily in clinical practice. And they found that really, really difficult to reconcile and found that there was a lack of good role models in terms of good person-centred care. That led myself and a colleague, Professor Marianne Hardy from the University of Bradford here in the UK, to think about, well, how do we actually do that then? How do we give student radiographers something to measure themselves against? And in terms of, are they delivering good person-centred care? Because at the time that I did this piece of original research back in 2017, there was no evidence base for person-centred care within radiography. There was lots within medicine, there was lots within nursing, there was lots within some of the other allied health professions like physiotherapy, but there was nothing specific to radiography. So Professor Hardy and I thought, okay, we've found a gap here. This is something we could research, and it was something that could actually be my PhD project, which it was. So we put a bid in for funding to carry out a big research project here in the UK. We submitted to the College of Radiographers Industry Partnership Scheme, known as CORIPS for short, and we were awarded £13,000 worth of funding to carry out the research in December 2017. So what happened during the research project then? Well, a lot happened during the research project. There were two stages to it. The first stage was an online survey using a software package called Qualtrics, which is really, really good for eliciting large amounts of data and then being able to run statistical analysis on them. Within the Qualtrics survey, we had 42 paired statements, longitudinal statements, with one version which was positive and one version which was negative. And that was done very deliberately to see if the positive and negative versions of those statements correlated, and obviously we hoped that they would. The statements were taken from key documents here in the UK about what good person-centred care looked like, so using documentation from Health Education England, from the Health Foundation and from the Picker Institute to actually pull out different aspects of person-centred care and putting them into a radiography context. We launched a survey at the UK IO conference in 2018 using a poster with a QR code on it to encourage participation. We also promoted it extensively via social media and via university service user groups to try and get as many people as possible from a lived experience background participating in the project. We aim to get 150 people participating in the survey to give us a breadth of experience and insight, and we aim to get 30 people per participant group. So we had 5 participant groups. We had our service users, our patients, we had clinical radiographers, we had radiography managers, we had radiography academics, and we had radiography students. So we wanted to get 30 from each of those 5 groups. We actually far exceeded that, and we got 350 participants altogether, which was amazing and obviously gave us really rich data, which we could be sure, because of the amount of participants we had, was obviously very rigorous as well. Most of our participants were UK based, but we did get some responses from Australia, New Zealand and Canada. That was unexpected and very, very welcome. And what we did was actually extract those responses and analyse those separately so that we got a UK perspective, but then we also looked at what the perspective was from those other countries. So a huge amount of data from the stage 1 survey, which we, like I say, we statistically analysed to see the significance of the responses to the different attitudinal surveys. And then in stage 2, we used a series of focus groups and semi-structured interviews. Again, we had a range of participants in this. So we had different focus groups for different groups of participants. So our service users had their own groups, our students had their own groups, our radiographers, managers and educators had their own groups. And that was to avoid issues of power and authority and people feeling it was a safe space for them to be honest about their experiences and what they thought about person-centred care in radiography. Most of the focus groups were done, well, all of the focus groups were done face-to-face. Some of the semi-structured interviews, they were done via the telephone, and that was due to travel constraints and people not being able to attend the focus groups in person. We worked with them to find a date and time to do an individual semi-structured interview to make sure they were still able to be involved. All of the focus groups and semi-structured interviews were audio recorded and then they were transcribed verbatim. The transcripts were then analysed using Brown and Clark's 6-step approach to thematic analysis. And that gave us some very, very rich findings, which I'm going to go through now in turn of participant group. I always like to start with the service user perspective because I think obviously this is the one that is really, really key. We need to understand what our service users think about our delivery of care and then think about how that then correlates to what our professionals think and what our students think. So our service users said very, very clearly that there were a number of different priorities that they had, and we've picked the top 5 priorities for this group and the other participant groups. So first of all, they talked about technical competence. They talked about how essential it was to feel confident that the radiographer that was doing their imaging examination was technically competent and safe to practice. And actually that was the same in all 5 participant groups. Technical competence was seen in all groups as the foundation of person-centred care by providing safe clinical practice. So we can almost put that now to one side because all of the participant groups agreed on that. Technical competence was the foundation. However, what came after that did differ a lot. Those service users talked a lot then about the importance of information. It was almost as if they couldn't get enough information about what was going to happen to them, about how they were going to get their results and about any aftercare that was needed. They talked about the need for differing versions of information, about not relying on written information, about having opportunity to ask questions. They talked a lot about feeling that information was sometimes quite rushed in its delivery, and they really wanted to get as much information as possible from the person that was doing their imaging examination. They then talked a lot about human interaction with the radiographer. They talked about physical and psychological care. They talked about how sometimes in the past, when they'd been for an imaging examination, they felt like something on a conveyor belt, so as if they were an item in the factory on a conveyor belt. And if we think about that, how many times do we hear in departments it referred to that there are 5 chest x-rays waiting outside, or there's 10 CT brain scans on a list to do today? So I think sometimes that reductionist approach does creep into clinical practice, and certainly the service users involved in this research had picked up on that and really, really thought that more could be done to have a human interaction with them as a service user. They also talked a lot about privacy and dignity. They talked a lot about some of the gowns that we ask people to wear in the UK and how undignified they are. A lot of our gowns have quite difficult fastenings at the back that first of all can be hard to do up, but secondly can waft about and become open and leave them exposed. They talked about the state of the changing rooms and whether the changing room was a secure place to get changed, or whether it had a door that could be locked, or whether somebody could get into it. They talked about being asked to get changed and then sit back in the waiting room in their x-ray gown alongside people who were fully dressed, and how undignified that was. So there was lots and lots of things to unpack there in terms of privacy and dignity. And then their final priority was the environment. So they talked a lot about what the imaging department was like, how it was decorated, what the signage was like, about issues around parking, transport to get to their imaging examination. All of these things definitely fed in. The key messages that came from our service users were, though, that very simple things can make a massive difference. So the use of "hello, my name is" was referred to many, many times. Hello, my name is, if you haven't come across it, is a campaign that's very big in the UK as a result of Dr. Kate Granger and her experiences being treated with cancer as a medical doctor. And she reflected upon the fact that when she was being treated and cared for, very, very few people actually stopped and introduced themselves, who they were, what their role was and what they were going to be doing. They just got on with things. So Hello, my name is a movement that's been gaining increasing traction here in the UK. It's a really simple thing to actually level the playing field and help our patients think straight away, this is somebody I can talk to. So introducing yourself as, hello, my name's Emma, I'm going to be doing your MRI scan today. It's a really great way to start the interaction with the person on that level playing field and gain their trust. Our service users also talked a lot about simple gestures. So they talked about just a smile. A simple smile can make a massive difference. But they also talked about appropriate touch. So, for example, a supportive hand on the shoulder or holding a patient's hand where it's appropriate during an examination. All these things made a massive, massive difference to them, and very simple things for us to do. They also reflected a lot on efficiency. Now, here in the UK, our departments are very, very busy, as I'm sure yours are worldwide. And our service users reflected upon the fact that there seemed to be a perception that bustling around and being busy, being efficient, might instill confidence in people that they were going to get person-centred care. But actually, the service users felt that wasn't always the case. And actually, sometimes that was quite off-putting. And they encouraged radiographers to think about that and to think about how they conveyed themselves around the department, and to actually slow down a little bit and take the foot off the gas in terms of, yes, efficiency is important, but actually care is more important. So some really, really interesting points there. The next three participant groups I've deliberately put together. So these are the clinical radiographers, the radiography managers and the radiography educators. So as you can see, their top 5 priorities in terms of person-centred care was technical competence. They all saw that as the foundation of being person-centred. So as I've said already, we can almost put that to one side. But what came afterwards was different. And you can see here highlighted in yellow that word efficiency that I just talked about in terms of the service users. So radiographers, managers and educators all acknowledged how important efficiency was. They knew it was a tension in terms of person-centred care. But interestingly, the radiographers and the managers felt that efficiency, being efficient, was a way to be person-centred because they were getting people through their examination more quickly, and therefore that was better care. The service users, as you've already heard, though, had a different perspective on that and didn't feel that that was person-centred care. But radiographers and managers thought that it was because it was getting people through more quickly. Radiography educators talked about it from a slightly different point of view. They acknowledged that being efficient was helpful because they could see the links in terms of getting people through the department more quickly, keeping waiting lists down. They also acknowledged the tension that the service users did, which is why it's the last one on the list for them. All 3 groups talked about information, and as you can see, they either put it second or third in terms of their priority. What was really, really interesting there was some of the comments that the clinical radiographers made. So they talked about when they felt particularly time pressured, how they might be careful about how they phrase things to avoid leading questions, because if the leading questions occurred, they hadn't got time to answer them. And that was quite sad. And I have to say, the radiographers that said this also said that that was sad. They were not happy that this was the situation. They felt the pressure for efficiency drove that behaviour. And that was something that they wanted to change. They didn't like the fact that that happened. They all talked a lot about privacy and dignity. So you can see that it's one of their top 5 priorities for all 3 groups. And they also talked about physical and psychological care. So again, it's up there in terms of one of the priorities for all 3 groups, but in slightly different places. So the themes that were coming out were very, very similar. They were just slightly different in order. What was really interesting, though, was how the student group differed. So their 5 priorities were, again, similar topics, but coming from quite a different perspective. So they also saw technical competence as the foundation of being person-centred. They talked about efficiency, though, in a very negative way. They talked about how they felt time pressures as a student, about how they often felt rushed to do things more quickly than they felt able to, and about how they felt that meant that they weren't able to give the care that they wanted to. They talked a lot about information. They talked in particularly in a positive way about how, as a student, they felt sometimes they had opportunities to provide more information. Because they were a student, they could take time outside the examination room to talk to a patient for longer. And they really valued that, and thought that was a good position for them to be in as a student. They talked about physical and psychological care, and similar to my original piece of research, they talked about not always observing what they expected and how difficult that could be, and they talked about privacy and dignity. The students were most like the service users in terms of their answers, and we concluded that that was because they were still independent observers of practice. They had not yet been socialised fully into the profession of radiography and were still able to see things from an outsider point of view. So it gave them a window, a perspective on situations that was much more like the service users than any of the other groups. So really, really interesting and really powerful. We were very, very glad that our students were involved in the research and gave us that perspective. So all of those findings, as I say, they were brought together. They were published in a series of peer-reviewed journal articles in the Radiography Journal. And within one of those articles, in Article 2 out of the 3, we published our theoretical model for patient-centred care in diagnostic radiography. So you can find that in the Radiography Journal, published in 2021. And what the theoretical model says is that there are 3 key areas for person-centred practice within radiography. So if we start at the top of the Venn diagram here, there's perception of care. So this is aspects such as privacy and dignity, communication, including any carers that are with the patient, and thinking about comfort and care such as warmth, positioning aids, etc. Then if we come down to the bottom right, we've got control over the environment, which includes things like transportation, security of belongings, what the waiting room is like, what the changing area is like, and what choice there is over things like gowns. And then in the bottom left corner, we've got event interaction. So the professionalism of the people that the service user encounters, the explanation and information giving that's received, the task focus, the efficiency focus. The 3 areas of the Venn diagram for the model then overlap. And you can see that there are things that are common to more than one of the 3 themes. So we've got the overlap of use of appropriate language, an opportunity to ask questions, between perception of care and event interaction. Between perception of care and control over environment, we've got the overlap of privacy while changing, choice of gowns, availability of dressing gowns and blankets, the waiting room itself, and then pillows and positioning aids. And then between control over environment and event interaction, we've got the overlap of the holistic approach. So it's not just an imaging examination. There are lots and lots of different parts to the interaction, right from the moment the person is referred for their imaging examination till they get their results. And we thought that the centre of all of this, as you can see in the middle of the Venn diagram, is care and communication. The communication at every stage is absolutely critical. The more you can communicate, the better. And care, in terms of demonstrating care at every step that you can, is absolutely fundamental. So how do we actually help and support radiographers to be more person-centred? Well, what Professor Hardy and I did after we had published all of our findings was develop a MOOC, a massive open online course. This is a free short course which is available on the University of Derby website. Hyperlink is here on the slide for you. Anybody can sign up to this and access it, and it provides free continuing professional development education specifically about person-centred care in radiography. So it's an educational toolkit. There are 6 units to it. The first 4 are information about person-centred care and how to deliver it in radiography. This is all based on Marianne and I's research, so it is from a UK context, but I'm sure internationally there's lots and lots of things that would be common across the board. The final 2 units within it are a self-audit and a organisational audit. So Unit 5 is a self-audit that you can do to see how you're currently doing in terms of your person-centred approaches to care. And it encourages you, once you've completed it, to develop a SMART action plan. And there's a template in there for doing that in terms of things you can do to change your practice. And what I would say is, this is encouraging you to think about things that are within your control, that you can change, so that it's up to you what you do about it. So it's things like using "hello, my name is," things like using silence, pausing when you're providing information to a patient to let them understand the information and process any questions they may have. It's things like providing an extra blanket or pillow. It's things we can all do. So I'd encourage you to have a look at this and think about where you are in terms of your practice. And are there any things that you could change in terms of how you do things? And then you can develop your action plan to help and support you to do that. And it might be useful if you have an appraisal system. It could be a useful thing to talk to your line manager about in your appraisal. The other tool, which is Unit 6 of the MOOC, is the organisational audit tool. And this is something that it will be really good for you to speak to your departmental governance or audit leads about. So it needs to be done at a departmental level, because it's thinking about some of the more structural things that link into person-centred care. So it might be thinking about what type of gowns are available. It might be thinking about the waiting rooms and the waiting areas, changing areas, how they're structured. It might be thinking about whether a dedicated quiet area is needed for patients with dementia. It might be thinking about a children's waiting room. There are all sorts of things that might come up in this depending on the nature of the services that your department provides and the type of patients that usually come to it. And that's why we say please do it with your organisational audit or governance lead, because these might be things that require investment. The personal one that we've already talked about, your self-audit, is things that you can change yourself. But the organisational tool is something that would actually require some buy-in from managers, because there may be investment required to actually undertake it. So Professor Hardy and I would really like to encourage you to take a look at the MOOC, to think about what's within your control, what you can change, and change it where you can, and lobby your departmental governance and audit leads in terms of the organisational audit and things that could be changed at a departmental level. That's where the bigger change will happen, of course, but don't forget that the little things that you can do straight away will make a massive difference to the individual patients that you see. So we have got an extensive list of further reading about our work and what we found during our research. All of the references are here for you to go away and follow up if you want to. So there are a range of peer-reviewed journal articles, books and book chapters, and also some literature on websites and in magazines, and of course the MOOCs that you've already heard about. I just want to finish by talking about those enablers and blockers before I send you all away. So please do think about the fact that, as I've said, there are things that are within your gift to change straight away. There are things that you can actually action that take no funding, take nobody else to change but you. And that's an enabler. That's an enabler that we can all pick up on and actually do something about straight away. So please don't think that person-centred care is something high up, something ethereal that requires your manager to buy into. You can change that straight away, and the purpose of the self-audit tool is to help you think about that. So it's supposed to be an enabler. The organisational audit tool is supposed to try and undo some of the blockers. So by getting your governance or audit lead involved in that organisational audit, that hopefully provides some evidence that can be given to senior managers for investment into things that would provide better, more person-centred care to your patients. And we hope that by doing it this way, with this two-pronged approach, we try to break down the blockers and enable person-centred care as much as we possibly can. So I think that's probably enough for me in terms of delivering this presentation. So I'll say thank you very much for listening. And I will be staying on the call with you afterwards. Take any questions, comments, thoughts that you've got about it. And I'd be really interested, particularly from people outside the UK, your perspectives on it and what might be the differences, the challenges for you in your particular context. Thank you very much, everyone.
Wow, thank you very much, Emma, for that wonderful talk on person-centred care. I'm just inviting Emma to turn her camera on. Thank you, Emma. Thanks very much for that. It was a wonderful presentation, a great way to kind of outline all of the research that you and Marianne have done with it. And it's an incredible piece of work. And I think what I really like about it is what you talked about right at the end about the enablers. It's really all about those little things, and not necessarily something that has to be done at an organizational level. It's much more about kind of role modeling that behavior for others to kind of to go in there with as well. Just want to kind of ask a few little questions here. One is about the fact that we currently have a big global shortage of our profession. And so that's actually putting a lot more pressure on people, particularly in terms of time pressures. And you did talk about time pressures a fair bit as well. And we know that even with the enablers, this person-centered care can still take that little bit of time, that little bit of extra time, even if it is that time to grab a pillow or a blanket or whatever that is. How do we maintain this level of service to be able to produce this person-centered care and also meet the demands of the public as well?
Thank you, Steve. Sorry, I was just struggling to switch the mute off there. So that's a great question to start us off, and it is one I get asked about a lot, which is why at the beginning I straight away acknowledge the pressures that I know we're all under. So everywhere is short of radiographers and healthcare professionals globally. So we do need to acknowledge that. I think for me, one of the big things is taking a person-centered approach usually results in us feeling a sense of satisfaction in the care that we've provided. So it increases our job satisfaction. It makes us more happy in our work. And there's a very direct correlation that has been evidenced numerous times that I talk about a lot in my role at the Personalised Care Institute. So I think that's the first thing, that actually, yes, it might take us slightly longer, but actually it makes us more satisfied in the work that we're doing, makes us feel it's more worthwhile, and also, of course, ensures the patient has a better experience. The second thing I would say, though, is some of the things that I talk about that we can all do actually I would argue, don't take any extra time. And in some cases, perhaps reduce even the time for more complex examinations. So to start with some of the things that I don't believe take any extra time, hello, my name is. For me to say, hello, my name is Emma, I'm the radiographer that's doing your scan today, doesn't take me any extra time. I can be saying that as I'm walking the patient into the room. So it doesn't hold me up in any way. It's something I can say as part of the journey into the room or as the patient enters the room. Then if we think about things like offering the patient additional comfort aids so that they are more able to tolerate the procedure, that usually doesn't take any extra time either. A lot of the things that we need to do when we're positioning our patients mean that we need things like sandbags, we might need wedge pads, we might need an extra pillow anyway. So again, it's just thinking a little bit more broadly about what else that particular individual might need. And then thirdly, if we think of more complex examinations, and particularly one of the areas I was a specialist in clinical practice, MRI, for example, if we really don't take attention and listen to what our patients need and make sure that we are being person-centered when we prepare them for their imaging examination, we know there is a direct correlation to anxiety-induced claustrophobia in MRI. So if we don't take the time to settle them, make them comfortable, give them the information that they need, give them time to ask questions, then there is a chance of anxiety-induced claustrophobia happening, which actually means we end up abandoning the examination and potentially losing an appointment slot. So I would argue actually in terms of efficiency, it makes us more efficient by spending an extra minute or two rather than losing a whole appointment slot. Is that enough to start us off, Steve?
That's absolutely perfect. No, I think you've hit the nail on the head. And I think just to kind of add to that as well, like I come from a pediatric background, and one of the sayings we sometimes have is where does -5 equal 30? And it's basically that you take 5 minutes out of your time to establish that rapport with the patient to show that you've got that person-centered care going on. You're actually going to probably save yourself about half an hour during the procedure because they're going to be so much more cooperative, because it's usually the uncooperative ones that tend to take a lot longer anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so just to kind of add to that as well, it was really good in the research that you did to kind of get the perspective of the students. And I think, in particular, just seeing them as kind of like the what did you call them, like the external observers or the independent observers, I guess. How did this make them feel when they are going to enter the profession, knowing that this is what they've already seen about person-centered care?
Yeah, so the students that were involved were really passionate about person-centered care, and I think for them, a huge motivator to be involved in the research was it was something that they didn't want to lose sight of as they became qualified. So most of the students that were involved were actually final year students here in the UK. They were all in the UK, I should qualify, but most of them were in the final year as well. So they were very, very passionate about it. So they reflected on examples of poor practice that they'd seen where they thought that poor care had been delivered. And from their perspective, they wanted to do everything they could to not follow other radiographers down that path. So they were almost there participating in the research, telling us how they were going to resist that. So they were going to resist that culture of being socialized into poor practice. And Marianne and I both found that incredibly inspiring. And some of the things that they talked about, for example, being able to spend extra time talking to a patient, perhaps sitting with them in a waiting area and holding their hand to reassure them, those sorts of things. There were some brilliant examples of things that they could do that made a massive difference. And they were really keen to hold on to that once they qualified.
And did that then change the way that you approach the students when you were preparing them for clinical placement, when they're actually going out into the field and doing their clinical placement, to basically just say, watch what other people do and watch the things that actually are enabling this person-centered care versus things that aren't?
Yes, absolutely. So here in the UK, obviously my own university, Derby, but many of the other universities in the UK that deliver radiography education actually use the MOOC as part of their preparation for clinical placement now in year one of their programmes. So at Derby, what we do is we ask the students to do the first 4 units of the MOOC before they go on their first clinical placement, so that they have a really in-depth understanding of what person-centred care is. That's then followed up with an interactive workshop with me where we talk through some different scenarios and things that might happen. And they work in groups to think about what could have been done differently, how the situation could be improved. So some of the situations aren't necessarily focused specifically on the patient, and this is quite deliberate. They might also bring in some of the caring responsibilities that the patient has and the impact that might have on them. Or they also might think about a situation where the carer that's with a patient becomes unwell as too. So that it's trying to get them to think really, really holistically about everything that's going on for that individual. And we hope that by doing that, by doing this really thorough preparation through completing the MOOC and then this workshop, that they have got that in-depth understanding. And certainly in the evaluation work that we've done here at Derby, that seems to be the case, that they go out feeling confident about what they can do and the tools and techniques that they can put into practice. We also talk to them, as you say, about looking for role models as well, about who is it in a particular department that they want to be like, which radiographers stand out to them as being person-centred, and encourage them to model that kind of behaviour too.
That's incredible, and I think that's a really important part about it is, I think, looking at the holistic kind of part of it and the carers, and again, kind of going back to the pediatrics, and that's something that we have to watch out for as well. You've got to watch out about how you actually can help parents and caregivers in terms of how they're looking after the children and looking after the patients as well. So a really important point. When we kind of talk about the toolkits as well towards the end, and I think we all probably feel that we can do better in some way, shape, or form when we're delivering person-centered care. Do you get much feedback from those that have actually done the toolkit, that have actually used it, done the self audit or even the organizational audit? Do you get much feedback towards you to see where people are going wrong and where they're not, or where they might want some help?
Yes, and interestingly, in fact, I've just had a set of feedback through on the MOOC just this week, which had about 300 responses to the evaluation that's built into it, talking about what people had learned from it. So there was some really positive feedback in there in terms of what people had taken away, about how it had encouraged them to think differently, and about some of the barriers to person-centered care that it helped them to think about how they could overcome. So we do look at that feedback continually, and obviously think about improvements and things that we can do in terms of the resources. Then I think the next key thing for us, certainly that I picked up from the feedback this week, is that we probably need to get a little bit more video content in there, actually, just to bring to life some of the things that we're talking about. I think that's a reflection of the times, isn't it? And I think about how people engage with material. So there aren't any videos on there currently, and that's something we need to look at so that we can actually show some good role models delivering really good person-centered care.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think that the educational aspect of using interactiveness, I think, is certainly something that we all kind of are striving for a little bit more now, is particularly in the post-COVID era, I think, anyway. Emma, look, we're coming to the end. I just wanted, have you got any like last take-home points that you'd like people to kind of take away with them before they finish today?
Yes, absolutely. I was really hoping that there was going to be a link available for me to share with everybody today to a new article that's literally about to be published in the Journal of Medical Imaging and Radiation Sciences. It will be out in the next few days, so please keep an eye on social media. I will certainly share it as soon as it goes live. But in that new article, what you will see is the results of a piece of research that has been carried out in South Africa, which has replicated the original UK study to see what the similarities and differences are in the South African context. We then will have further articles coming out over the next few months, where the study has also been replicated in Australia and in New Zealand. And then there will be a final summary article, which will probably be published next year, which pulls all of those findings together into one summary article looking at the similarities and differences. So some of the things that have come out already that we know is that actually the issues that the service users raised and the students raised were incredibly similar. And some of the things that have come out differently are things like rural communities, particularly in South Africa, and the impact that has in terms of physical proximity to locations. And of course, in Australia, we know that that's going to be an issue too for people living in very rural and remote areas. So please watch this space in terms of those publications coming out, and please get in touch if you've got any further questions, comments, thoughts around person-centered care that you want to touch base with me about.
Oh, that sounds like an incredible amount of work there, and I'm sure that once this kind of comes out, then we will share it through social media as much as we possibly can as well. And so, yeah, that will be great to see, I think, anyway. Emma, thank you very, very much for joining us. It's been wonderful to have you on, and what an incredible piece of work, and really something that we can all take away in our care, in the way that we deliver care to our patients and to the caregivers as well. Thanks very much, Emma.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.